Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Watier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Watier, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Doing fantastic, my friend. Excited to continue the kickoff of 2026.
Oh, yeah.
Excited for what we have in store for this year. We're going to put insulin at the forefront of this year and our focus, as we always do, with adopting a fasting lifestyle, losing the weight once and for all, getting off that diet regain train roller coaster. And we're right smack dab in the middle of New Year's resolutions where they start to fade, and that willpower kind of comes and goes and ebbs and flows. So we're going to give you some actionable things that you can do today to continue to build your fasting lifestyle. We're on this journey with you and make 2026 the best year yet. So if you're new to the podcast, welcome in. Thanks for giving us a shot. If you want to know more about our stories and how fasting transformed our lives, head back to episode 0, episode 1. Give it a quick listen, give you some insights into how fasting transformed us and ultimately why we do what we do week in and week out in this podcast with our challenges, our coaching, our resources, all of the things that we do, taking on this obesity and metabolic disease epidemic that we have here, not just in the U.S., but across the world. So if you're listening in from across the sea, across the world, across one of the oceans, it's just been amazing, Tommy, that just this message and what we do has reached so many folks. So we are so grateful for you listening in. If you're a long-term listener, shout out to the OGs. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep getting those repetitions. Keep adopting and taking action on a day-to-day basis. And Tommy, with that, I want to give a shout out to one of our favorite reviews, and grateful that we have so many of the 5-star variety. This is from Hills for Tacos, Tommy. Great tips for getting through situations. Break it down.
Yeah, Hills for Tacos said, I've listened to every episode of this podcast, and episode 311 was probably the best. Wow. Most actionable advice I've heard the guys provide. I absolutely love the best days versus floor day comparison as a tool to keep the guardrails in when the plan doesn't quite work out. I'll definitely be re-listening to this one. So put a bookmark by 311 there, and if you haven't checked it out yet, absolutely do that, because as we kind of come into a new year, that's a great time for that sort of perspective there, because every day is not going to be a 10, but so many of us can get kind of stuck with that perfectionism mindset, or it can be frustrating or even like discouraging when things aren't kind of going perfectly as planned. But when we have kind of a backup plan for each one of our new habits or even the old habits that we know we want to stick with, then that means that when the day's not a 10, I still have a plan to keep that ball juggling in the air, to kind of keep it alive rather than going to 0, which is unfortunately like the easier thing to do. But episode 311 is going to help kind of put those guardrails in place. So go check it out and tell us what you think. And thanks for the feedback, Hills for Tacos.
Love your name too, by the way.
Yeah.
So that episode came out on December 16th. It's now January 20th. And the intention was to give some freedom through the holiday season, but it absolutely applies to any of the life events and the Hallmark calendar and what this year has in store.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely love it. One of the foundational episodes we've done. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback on it, so thank you, Hills for Tacos.
Yes.
But Tommy, let's get into I just want to keep saying that name.
I know.
Let's get into to today's conversation. So we're coming up with 316, 17 episodes in now, with more coming. We don't plan to stop, and it's always like, okay, what should we be talking about? What do people want to hear? We look at the comments, we read your messages, we answer your questions. And really, you just want to start with the foundation. So this came through my inbox through Levels Health, which is a CGM metabolic type company. And and Dr. Ben Bikman also writes for them and is collaborates with them as well, is affiliated with them. So Dr. Ben Bikman, if you're not aware, he wrote the book on insulin, Why We Get Sick. Highly recommend. You can go to the show notes. We'll put a link there for it. It's one that I revisit often. It stays on my quick hit list on my shelves behind me. I have one little cubicle behind me where, those are the books that I go to that I typically don't have to sit down and reread, but will go to for reference or just an analogy or a talking point, or just to get a kind of focus from time to time.
Yeah.
So the article was actually saying 5 surprising metabolic insights from Ben Bikman. So I went and listened to the hour and 45-minute podcast where he was breaking down the metabolic insights. And we're really going to take a myth-busting kind of conversation today and how we are adapting a fasting lifestyle and why insulin is in that key driver's seat. We're going to double down and focusing on insulin and metabolic function this year, which drives ultimately why most people come to fasting, which is for weight loss. Right? And then the secondary: increased energy, better libido, less brain fog,
Better blood work,
reversal of metabolic disease, reversal of diabetes. Yes, it's possible. Prevention of future metabolic disease and conditions. Because the reality is we have a chronic obesity and chronic lifestyle epidemic that's going on right now. We have more healthcare and more advancements and more medications than ever before, but we're not healthy as a general population. So you have control of this. You have levers that you can pull. The problem is there's a lot of noise out there that lives in the obesogenic, food noise-filled world that we live in. So we're going to take a perspective today to expand on this conversation about 5 metabolic takeaways from this podcast from Dr. Ben and his deep dive that he does. And I mean, he is one of the world's leading researchers, or might be even the world's leading researcher on insulin and metabolic disease. So with that long open, what are these 5 surprising insights? So let's get into, we're just going to kind of unpack these one by one, where chronic lifestyle conditions kind of lurk beneath the surface, right? Yearly blood work, yearly labs with your doc don't really get you into the preventative mindset when it comes to healthcare. They're more reactionary.
Sure.
So
let's watch it.
Let's watch it. Let's watch and wait. Oh, this is ticked up a little. This is ticked down a little. So you may have normal labs, but the weight's still not moving. You may be counting calories and tracking macros and getting your steps in, but the scale's not moving. Your glucose and your A1C are fine, yet you're tired, gaining weight, and starting to collect those abnormal labs and diagnoses that come along with the later stages of life, right? But the thing is, if we focus on the keystone, which is insulin, then we can start to unpack how your fat cells, your insulin, things like saturated fat, all tie back to a fasting lifestyle, better food choices, and long-term metabolic health.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned saturated fat there, because maybe we should be thinking about that a little bit differently, not as sensitive to the saturated fat that we're bringing in, but actually how that saturated fat is showing up within our blood work, right? And the same thing goes for insulin when we think about fat loss and body composition and gaining weight and all of these comorbidities that come along with lifestyle disease, like you mentioned. It's actually like lifestyle-based disease is a way to look at it. For the main problem for most people listening to this podcast is not necessarily under availability of calories, right? Energy. Yeah. There is for a lot of us, there is fortunately energy all around us.
Surplus.
Yeah, surplus. And
we're
obviously
in feast mode.
Unfortunately, we can easily default to feast mode, and what that means is that our body is just seeing it as energy coming in, and something needs to happen with that. We can only process so much at a time, and depending on what macronutrients are coming in, what sort of exercise and caloric expenditure we have, means we're going to have a different hormonal response to the energy coming in. So if we can understand that that's the basis for what actually happens to the calories coming in, then we can start to understand why a calorie isn't just a calorie. Yes, the calories matter, but the hormonal response to those calories matters so much. And it's so much more difficult to be tangible. There's no insulin response that's on a food label. A food label does not tell you what's going to happen within your body to the calories that are coming in. So it feels less tangible for us, but it's actually determining more of what happens within our body composition than the total number of calories. And so if we can just put that at the forefront and then say, okay, well, it's not really super tangible in real time when I make a food decision, but here are the general principles for it, and here's why it's so important, then we can start making better choices that support our fasting lifestyle and support our body composition and longevity and long-term goals, even without it being as tangible as counting calories, which most of us know counting calories just is not all that effective. If you have a history of weight gain and weight loss, you're more in the insulin resistance camp. If you're less insulin resistant, you have a better, leaner body composition, and you're looking at that, then the calories are going to be more representative of what's actually happening, right? Does that make sense?
It does, and that's really going to set us up for the conversation. The starting point of today's conversation is that insulin affects every single cell in your body.
Mm-hmm.
That's unusual, right? Because when you hear insulin, you typically think diabetes or blood sugar.
Sure.
But insulin's reach extends far beyond just managing your blood sugar. It literally touches every cell in your body. So that's uncommon for one of the hormone signals. Typically, when you have a protein-based hormone, that's going to affect a specific tissue, like a thyroid.
Mm-hmm.
But insulin is really a metabolic conductor. So think of like the Boston Symphony, right?
The maestro.
The guy doing the thing, or the woman doing the thing with the stick that I have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
But they're conducting that
They
beautiful
seem to be
noise,
important, though, right?
That beautiful sound that comes out, right, of all those very talented individuals. So it's really a metabolic conductor that tells your cells throughout your entire body what to do with what you were talking about, Tommy, is that energy that we have access to.
Mm-hmm.
Whether to store it, burn it, or hold on to it temporarily.
Yeah, or convert it.
So that helps explain why insulin resistance can manifest in seemingly unrelated health problems, from infertility to brain fog to high blood pressure to cardiovascular disease. And here's a couple of examples. So erectile dysfunction and PCOS. Those are metabolic conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So insulin affects the endothelium for blood flow, nitric oxide and vasodilation.
Mm-hmm.
And it also affects sex hormone balance. So a performance issue, not from a physical, but also a mental state.
Mm-hmm.
So similarly with PCOS. There's an insulin component, a metabolic component to that. So when we start fasting, limiting our carbohydrates, making better food choices, we'll give you some tangible action steps. This is why we see so many people, like our rockstar coach Kieran, changes in cycles, libido, mental clarity, because it's the hormonal plumbing, that conducting, that's going on beneath the surface with insulin as the conductor. There's less insulin chaos, better vascular and hormonal signaling to all of those different, in this example, reproductive organs and sex hormone organs. Mm-hmm. This is similar for cardiovascular disease. This is why we're going to talk about saturated fat. Just had a conversation with a family member recently about saturated fat and how it's been demonized. Like, avoid red meat. Well, we should probably be avoiding carbohydrates. We'll unpack that from a mechanistic standpoint. And the fact that the low-fat movement, low-salt, low-fat movement in the late 70s, early 80s has resulted in higher rates of cardiovascular disease and metabolic disorders than ever before, even though we have more cholesterol-lowering medications, better scanning technology, all of these different advancements. So when we're looking at this, insulin is that conductor. So we need to look at this as, okay, where does the insulin cascade start, where we then see an abnormal liver enzyme elevation, an elevation in blood pressure, a metabolic syndrome, increased visceral adiposity, central weight gain, waist circumference, increased blood pressure. Well, it starts in the actual thing that we're trying to remove or shrink when we come to fasting to lose weight. It starts in the fat cell. And your fat cells become insulin resistant first, and that's actually a protective mechanism. So as Bikman says, the slow march of insulin resistance starts at the fat cell. So when a fat cell undergoes hypertrophy, which is growing larger in size rather than multiplying and creating new fat cells, it must become insulin resistant to prevent its own destruction. So insulin tells fat cells to store more energy. But when it's stretched to capacity, it needs to become insulin resistant to protect itself.
So it doesn't rupture.
And this is where we see this in different ethnicities, where they can be relatively lean, but yet have higher rates of type 2 diabetes. It's the difference in the fat cell behavior. There is some slight genetic background. Right? Some people make more smaller fat cells, while others favor what I was just describing, which is making fewer fat cells, but making them larger.
Yeah.
And small fat cells are very insulin sensitive and anti-inflammatory, but the larger fat cells automatically create an inflammatory cascade, so that we like to say it this way, that these fat cells become metabolically active. This is why we say, let's get the weight moving quickly, because you probably heard, don't lose the weight too fast, right?
Sure.
Let's get the scale moving quickly and get a big chunk of that weight off, because then your body's going to be able to function better metabolically and reverse some of this first step of insulin resistance, which starts at that fat cell.
Yeah, because when the fat cells are overfilled, like what you were talking about, they're sending out a completely different hormonal communication cascade that then goes to all of the other cells in the body as well, and has feedback loops back up to the brain. So then you have an imbalance in leptin and ghrelin and hunger and satiety cues that happen actually because of the fat cells growing in insulin resistance. So this is where the problematic kind of the positive feedback loop, and that sounds like a good thing, it's actually not, happens within overfilled fat cells and insulin resistance. And so that's really the cycle that we need to break with fast cycling, so that when we throw a wrench into that link of communication right there from the fat cells and then back to the brain back to the fat cells, and then all throughout the bloodstream, whenever we throw a wrench in that communication cycle, then we can start the reversal of all of the other comorbidities that go along with it. To your point, Scott, of actually just starting to get some of that weight off, start shrinking some of those overfilled fat cells. And it's amazing how, cravings get different, get easier to deal with. They go down. It becomes easier to consistently fast because we're actually getting better hormonal signals too.
And that's the catch, is your glucose may be normal. And the myth would be, if your glucose is normal, you're not insulin resistant. But the reality is, in early insulin resistance, and this was me, I'll share you the details if you want to head back and hear my story, listen to the first couple episodes of the podcast. But this was me trying to figure out, like, what the heck? I'm doing all the right things, but it's just not working. Because your blood sugar, your A1C and glucose will remain normal for years, even though that insulin resistance at the fat cell and then systemically, whole body, kicks in later on down the road. So there's like this time under tension concept. The amount of time that this process is going on from a metabolic standpoint then leads to your blood sugar eventually rising because your body can't compensate.
Your fat cells are almost acting like a sponge to soak up that extra insulin. Like basically, they become a buffer to your own development of being able to even see the problem of abnormal glucose, because it's actually the insulin that's abnormal under the surface. But insulin is much harder to test. It's not normally looked at,
not readily ordered.
Right, and even just the foundations of understanding diabetes it came from just a sweet smelling, and actually they used to taste urine back in the day as a quick diagnostic method. And so just that sweet urine became kind of like blood sugar became the central like theme for diabetes and understanding blood sugar and blood sugar related issues. It all became about blood glucose, but upstream from that is the insulin problems that have been mounting and growing for years, like you said, and most likely decades, that have been essentially like covered up or almost undetectable under the surface. Not quite undetectable, but usually just not detected because they've been lying underneath the surface.
And one of the most common issues is chronic fatigue, brain fog, wired and tired, sleep disturbances. Those are all indications that your blood sugar balance, those big swings due to that insulin resistance, is there, and it translates into weight loss resistance and non-scale movement, right? Mm-hmm. So the progression of that fat goes from fat to the liver, to the muscle, to the endothelium, to the brain, explaining why some people look mildly overweight, but already have fatty liver, hypertension, and cognitive issues. Mm-hmm. So it's not this concept. One thing we are going to talk about is here in a minute is so that fat cell itself is an endocrine organ. So those bigger fat cells create that chronic inflammatory response. So that's why we like to measure hsCRP, which is a whole body systemic inflammation marker. Mm-hmm. You have insulin resistance there, but this also starts leaking fatty acids into the bloodstream. And when you think fatty acids in the bloodstream, then you start thinking cholesterol. Then you start thinking cardiovascular disease. That's why we're going to have the conversation around saturated fat, specifically because of this process. So we're talking about, to summarize the first kind of segment here, is it's not just the calories, it's the hormones. Hmm. So insulin, stress hormones, cortisol, circadian rhythm, sleep, and that inflammatory cascade change how the body handles the output or the usage of the energy that you're taking in. So it's either going to drive or reverse insulin resistance. It's never really staying the same. So things that drive insulin resistance: too much insulin, frequent carb intake, snacking, too much stress, an abnormal stress response, your HPA axis, and then ultimately that inflammatory, too much inflammation, chronic inflammation, the arthritises, the itises of the world, gingivitises, cellulitises, arthritises, right? Anything that has an itis at the end, that's an inflammatory response.
Yeah. You mentioned those carbohydrates, but right before bed, even just late night food, late night carbohydrates being essentially the worst, but late night food in general is going to create an insulin response that and a blood sugar response that there's no ability for the body to actually process that and actually complete the job. Like it's like You've given it a task that can't be undone, but intuitively we think that job can be done while we're sleeping, but really it can't. And if you've ever worn a continuous glucose monitor, you can see what I mean, where that step up in blood sugar late in the evening, close to when you would be normally going to bed, it generally speaking doesn't fully recover, and so it leads to this overnight. And then a fasting blood glucose in the morning that's elevated in a way that's unexpected, and so you wouldn't necessarily intuitively think that that's going to be the case. And the more insulin resistance you have, the more that step up is going to still be there whenever you wake up in the morning, and then you ultimately get a crash in the morning that's more dramatic than it should have been, which then leads to a hypoglycemic response, which then leads to usually another carbohydrate craving. So then you can see how your choices from last night then affect how the next morning goes. How easy or difficult, how much more difficult is it to continue that fast into the next morning when that's how you're feeling, waking up after those food choices, the evening before. It's like you got one more thing that you got to kind of white knuckle through in order to get back into the swing of things, right? And then you can zoom out and kind of extrapolate that even more if that's been the case, and then you're going into New Year's time, New Year's resolution, and then oftentimes it can feel like you have a lot of instances of that you're kind of contending with, right?
Yep.
Which is why we talk about fast and in a fast cycling method versus thinking about it as just like kind of one fast independent from the next, right?
Yep, absolutely. So I want to talk just a minute about the insulin resistance. There's a fast and a slow process here. The insulin, the quick insulin response is really going to be that rapid reversible changes. These are going to be driven by your stress response, inflammatory bursts, certain foods you've eaten, poor nights of sleep, activity levels, etc. But then the long-term component is the tissue-specific resistance that we were talking about. This is where you'll see the different populations, ethnicities, and where the fat deposits are. That's why we talk a lot about visceral adiposity here. So the beer belly, the gut for men, the lower abdomen, hips, and thighs for women most of the time. That's really where we want to focus, because the glucose-centric medical system that we have misses this early process. So just to summarize this first kind of conversation is, before you see glucose or A1C go up, your fasting insulin's often been elevated for years. Blood pressure meds, statins, PCOS, ED, migraines, chronic inflammation, arthritis, all of those things I mentioned. So what are the levers that we can do as we transition into like testing and action steps here to really get a hold of this and make sure that we're working on it and not just waiting for it to become a bigger problem in the future? Is we want to talk about food choices, right? And this is where we're going to have the conversation around saturated fat. So we'll talk specifically about carbohydrates initially, because that's the first thing you think of, right? Carbs drive the biggest insulin response. They break down into glucose, give you the most amount of energy floating around in the system, and then your insulin needs to take over to do something with that, either shuttle it into a muscle cell. So we'll talk about muscle, body composition. It will either then store it as glycogen in the liver or fat cells that are trying not to rupture, if it can. So carbs, saturated fat, what's really happening in your bloodstream? So carbohydrates just don't raise the glucose like I just mentioned. What happens if you have excess carbohydrates, those are converted in the liver into saturated fat via the process of de novo lipogenesis, or DNL. And what Dr. Bikman has really isolated here in a lot of his research is that most of the saturated fat flowing through your system, which then eventually turns into VLDL, the small cholesterol particles, is when you have a high carb, low fat diet. So most of the saturated fat is made by the liver under the high carb, insulin resistant state, not from your butter or steak. So I'm just going to pause for a second. So you can, 3 meals a day, plus snacks, late night snacking, late meals, indulgent foods, hyperpalatable foods, high hedonic foods, restaurant foods, DoorDash foods, right? All that fun stuff.
Sure.
It's not necessarily the saturated fat that's in the food, because there are different forms of saturated fat. Saturated fat from red meat versus processed refined food, big difference. We want to know that your body is inherently smart. If we can focus on not eliminating carbohydrates, but refining the source, so refined natural carbohydrates like sweet potatoes, white rice, those things, sourdough bread, you're going to limit that transition of saturated fat production coming from the food choices that you're making, not from the demonization of what's in the butter and the red meat, if that makes sense, Tommy.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I mean, it makes sense, because when you're in more of a fat storage propensity environment within your body, that means your glycogen stores are high. Glycogen stores get high by feeding more often. You don't have to have high caloric intake, or you can be at a caloric balance. But when you're intaking food on a relatively pretty like a fairly often basis, so without time restriction of your food, you're more likely to spend more of that time in a higher glycogen state. And so the reason why is because you've had less time to burn through the previous
Yep.
meal by the next time that you go and bring in another meal. And so to say that it's that's not necessarily inherently bad, but understanding that without the time restriction of those meals, you're going to spend more of that time in a high glycogen state means that the body is ready to start storing fat. Because if glycogen stores are already high, there's nowhere else to put the excess fuel, mostly carbohydrates, but your body can basically turn what it needs to short term into more carbohydrates. It can take some of the macronutrients that you get, turn it into more carbohydrates, and then store it within the liver and even to a greater extent in the skeletal muscle. And so the more muscle you have on your frame, the more glycogen you can actually store.
Yeah, the more you can process.
Yes, absolutely. And then that also leads to bigger swings on the scale as well, which means that if you go off track or you have some time where you didn't utilize your floor strategies
Episode
like we were talking
311.
about, episode 311, you didn't exercise your more foundational fasting within your fast cycling, then you're storing more glycogen, and water weight has to come along with those glycogen molecules. So that's problematic as far as the physiology, but also as far as your mindset goes too, because it's a little tougher to feel motivated all the time when you're watching the scale either stay high or having these big swings in the scale. It can hit your mindset much worse and more dramatically than if you're maintaining control over what the scale's doing, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the main 5 takeaways from the Levels article. Now, we've expanded on that from going through the actual podcast with Dr. Bikman. But one of the main things is that carbohydrates before bed might be sabotaging your sleep more than you realize. And this is something that we preach in a fasting lifestyle is an earlier meal is always better because your insulin sensitivity goes down by up to 30% at night. So the same meal at 8 a.m. and the same meal at 8 p.m., you're going to have 30% less metabolic flexibility to be able to handle that load at night. And this is 100% true for me. This is why I don't drink anymore. Date nights, we'd go out, we'd eat well, not crazy indulgent. I'm not a big sweet dessert guy. Have a couple of drinks. I guarantee that my recovery on the next day was going to be red on my Whoop.
Yeah.
Every single time.
Yep,
like I know that is one lever that I can consistently bet on if I was a betting man, that it's going to be happening. So most sleep advice, and we teach this as well. You can grab our sleep guide on the website, thefastingforlife.com. It's a free little infograph, has some things to do to work on stabilizing your sleep. But it's like screen time, blue light, bedroom cool, stick to a schedule. But with a lot of our folks that use CGMs and we help coach them through kind of interpreting the data dump that happens, the overwhelm that happens, is carbs can activate that flight or flight response. So why am I so hot? Why do I feel anxious? Why am I wired or tired? I can kind of feel, anytime I would drink, I know I could like feel my heartbeat when I would go to bed.
Yeah.
Right? But that's from the glucose overload that's happening from the metabolic standpoint. So when you are in a hyperglycemic state and your blood sugar will spike, you activate your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight nervous system, your stress response. That's the last time you want to do that. So if you're going to have a heavier carb meal, make sure you prioritize protein with it and put it earlier in the day. 100%.
Absolutely. And even just that lifetime, that habit, that familial kind of habit of late night snacking.
That's what I grew up in. After dinner, ice cream, chips, popcorn. Yeah.
It doesn't even have to be like ice cream necessarily. I mean, it was for me and my family for sure, but it doesn't have to be. And it can still be very, very problematic because you still have a blood sugar response that requires an insulin response. And then so you're going to sleep with that. And you like, for me, I could sleep through basically anything, but at the same time, I wasn't getting that restful recovery. So it turns out sleep efficiency was very low, even though feelings of like being rested or being, it was easy for me to fall asleep and to stay asleep. I would sleep like a log. But a big part of that was actually the insulin load that was happening. And that was actually making for a deeper sleep. It's actually an overly deep sleep that leads to less heart rate variability. And it's really, really problematic over time. And it's very problematic for your longevity and your health and lifespan, actually.
Yep, absolutely. So what are some other levers that we can do here? So from a fasting and lifestyle perspective, obviously eat less often, shrink your time, shrink your nutrition window or nutrition opportunity, right? And
Get the weight off.
Yeah, not less. Just even if you're like, man, I'm still working with my hunger hormones. I've got an empty leg, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like I eat past fullness. Your hunger hormones are out of whack. Leptin, all those different types of things. Like eliminate that desire to snack during your fasting window, right? Use time restricted eating and fasting. So insulin has long times to come down between meals. And then from a macronutrient standpoint, reduce the refined processed carbs and sugars to lower that de novo lipogenesis that we talked about, that saturated fat production in your liver. Don't fear the meat, right? Fear the overabundance of energy surplus and carbohydrates that then eventually turn into the thing we don't want, which is that abnormal liver panel and that chronic level of inflammation. So prioritizing protein, whole food fats, that's going to support satiety, and prioritizing that protein is also going to protect the muscle through growth hormone and promote muscle growth, which is what we want as we age. We want to maintain that muscle, to your point earlier, to be able to maintain that metabolic reservoir, to be able to handle the energy that we have coming in. And then absolutely building muscle. We talk about this. Resistance training 3 times a week, zone 1, zone 2, walking with a weight vest. Doing things to help the fat cell, the fat oxidation, the burning of the fat, help your body help you. So resistance training increases that glucose utilization, stress reduction, managing your stress. There's always that study that we reference that 5 to 7 minutes of meditation actually decreased blood sugar in type 2 diabetics by up to 30%.
Yep.
Sleep hygiene, right? These things will all amplify the benefits of your fasting lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and even just like starting off the beginning of the year and going, okay, all of these things are important. That's great. But I don't like the idea that when everything's a priority, kind of nothing's a priority. So I like taking, the top 1 or 2 that feels like you haven't been all that, just mindful about, or you haven't really been, pulling those levers consistently, or they're the ones getting you, then those are definitely the ones to spend a couple minutes on, to double down on, to give yourself a reminder, put it in your phone, put it in your calendar, so that every single day you see that. And I mean, it can just start off with grabbing the blueprint to fasting for fat loss, because some of these things are outlined in there. You have some great fast cycling, regimens in there where you can get started. Put in those small little pieces that are going to lead to, okay, that's going to make the next fast that much easier. Then I get a little bit better sleep. I focus on that just a little bit. Okay. And then you kind of feel the momentum build. So pick 1 or 2 now, but then also be quick to add another 1 or 2 in, maybe in a few days, maybe it's a week or so after you feel like, okay, I got that one. Okay, let me add in a couple more. And you start feeling better. And guess what? That becomes its own source of motivation. So definitely go to thefastingforlife.com, grab the blueprint to fasting for fat loss.
Yeah, and the other resource we have there is the optimal lab range. So if you're looking at like what kind of labs you should be looking at, fasting insulin, free fatty acids, the triglyceride to HDL ratio, way more important than an LDL conversation with your doc. APOB, if you can get it. HOMA-IR, which is the gold standard. You need a fasting insulin and a fasting glucose to be able to calculate that. You can find those calculators online. Those are going to flag the metabolic dysfunction long before your fasting glucose, A1C, blood pressure, liver enzymes, long before that stuff starts to show up on your yearly routine blood work. So go grab that list as well if you're looking for some more specific lab-based advice. But Tommy, as we wrap up today, I'm trying to summarize this in 1 or 2 statements here, is that fasting isn't just about restriction and omission and eating less food. It's really about asking less of your insulin. So your cells can finally hear the signal again burn the fat your liver's been making from the carbs or the consistent insulin stimulation through eating and snacking throughout the day, and move you away from the quiet, glucose normal, labs are normal, metabolic crisis that the standard labs keep missing. So as we put insulin in the forefront this year, Tommy, final thoughts?
Well, just a matter of that your timing matters. We started off this conversation talking about, the calories do matter, but they're so much less of a factor when it comes to what your body actually does with those calories. So putting that into place so that you can be thinking about, what is my insulin response to this decision? Whether it's the decision to set your fasting timer, or for when you're going to be breaking your fast, or to maybe skip a dinner because it got a little too late in the day.
Yeah.
You say, you know what? I don't actually need to give these jobs to my body right now. Why don't we just focus on the rest? I'll come back for food in the morning. Why don't you make that one a breakfast? Not only did you get an extra 12 hours on your fast and some fat burning time, you protected your sleep, you had better insulin sensitivity the next day, and it's that much easier to stick to your next fast the next day. So be thinking about it as a timing and an insulin response rather than a caloric load, and you will be heading in the right direction for all of your choices.
Yep, absolutely. So let's do it, man. It's 2026. It's January 20th. We are in the throes of New Year, New Year's resolutions. Pick one or two things. Go grab a resource. Sign up for the next challenge. Reach out to us if you got questions, Tommy. Excited for what 2026 has for us here at Fasting for Life. More importantly, what it has for you in your transformation. Thank you so much once again for the 5-star reviews. We're so appreciative of this just amazing movement that we have. Grateful for all the listens, and we will be continuing to build our fasting lifestyle. We are on this journey with you. So let's go do it, Tommy. Thank you, as always, for the conversation, man, and we will talk soon.
Thank you. Bye. So, you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.